he was a cocaine dealer, um, and he was a very violent man. And so I was physically abused on a regular basis and sexually abused on a regular basis by this man. And he was very, very violent toward my mother, so much so that when we finally got out of that relationship, for the first year, it was, as a child, I just remember looking over my shoulder all the time, like, when's he going to show back up? When's this? You just never knew if the nightmare was truly over.
My life was just spiraling downhill.
Depression, alcoholism, incarceration, deaths by despair.
One guy who showed up is just Jesus.
If you can give a man clarity and community, he can start to live out his purpose.
You can break generational curses of alcoholism.
Welcome to Dudes Without Dads, the show that trains men how to become the dads they never had. Brandon Petty is one of those men who carries both grit and grace. He's a pastor of Generation Church in Portland, Tennessee, and his story didn't begin in the pulpit. It began in pain. Today, we're talking about formation, how the absence of a father often deforms us, how Jesus reforms us, and how intimacy with God conforms us, and how we're ultimately transformed for mission. Brandon, welcome to the Dudes Without Dads podcast.
Man, so blessed and honored, Josh. Thank you for having me.
For someone that doesn't know where your starting points are, where are you from?
It's interesting. I tell people all the time, like, I don't really have a hometown per se. I was born in Nashville, Tennessee, and I tell people I'm basically from Middle Tennessee. I grew up really all over Sumner County. So I spent probably the longest amount of years that I spent anywhere would have been Hendersonville, Tennessee. And that would have been about 3 to 4 years. But other than that, I was moved around a ton, and I'm sure we'll get into my story. But yeah, so Middle Tennessee. So I've always been born and raised, and I love it here.
Well, let's go ahead and start with your story. Mm-hmm. When you look back on your story, where's your starting points at? What are some of the memories that are your highs and lows from childhood?
Yeah, so I was born to a teenage mom. She got pregnant with me when she was 15 and gave birth shortly after turning 16. And so grew up just really, she dropped out of high school to help raise me. Obviously, I was raised by women primarily. I had 2 aunts, a grandmother and a mother, who took turns watching me while my mom worked sometimes 2 or 3 different jobs. She worked in the service industry for a long time, the restaurant industry, and waited tables and did those things all throughout my childhood to try to, provide for me. And through that, I had a ton of different males in my life that were either relationships, boyfriends, stepfathers. I think I tell people, and I don't know how fast you want to deep dive, but by the time my mother was 25, she had been married 6 times, I think. So just a ton of dysfunction and brokenness. And with that came a lot of men that came into our life. There was always either an element of drug abuse, alcohol abuse, physical abuse, and just really all forms of abuse from the time that I can remember, really from 7 to 8 years old through my early preteen years. But that's why we were moved around a lot. That's why I didn't stay in one place very long. We lived sometimes from apartment building to apartment building, sometimes out of motel rooms, sometimes with friends. Stayed with my grandmother quite a bit. Really grateful for her and her influence in my life. She was really kind of a constant, one of the anchors in my life as a child and as an adult. So, but yeah, that's kind of how my story started. And I was a mama's boy. I loved my mom deeply. Obviously not having a dad growing up. I didn't know my biological father until I was 15. And so he was older than my mother when they got together. And so they never married when I was a child or anything like that. And so didn't really still have some unanswered questions when it comes to surrounding my early childhood years. But yeah, that's kind of how my story started, was basically being in a broken home. Like I said, tons of dysfunction and abuse, and lots of different male figures in my life, but not really a dad. So.
When you
And
look back, sorry, when you look back at childhood, how would you have defined your relationship with your mom?
mm, um, probably, I would have, as a child, I would have said it was really good, right? Because I loved her, and I would get separation anxiety when I wasn't with her. I can remember when she got pregnant with my little brother. I'm 6.5 years older than my brother, so I was first, second grade whenever he was born. I went and stayed with my aunt while she was in the hospital, and I cried every day, just missing my mom. But looking back, I think there was some unhealthy codependency, especially growing up. My mother, I was the oldest grandson, the oldest son. So throughout my childhood, teen years, even young adult years, there was my entire family really had high expectations and really put a lot of pressure on me to help take care of people in my family, including my mother. And so there was an element there where, like, instead of her being the parent, I felt like growing up as a kid that I played a significant role of parenting my own parent. So looking back, probably a lot of unhealthy dynamics. In fact, later on in my adult years, I didn't realize that I carried so much probably animosity and pain toward my mother for things that happened as a child. Because when you walk through sexual abuse and physical abuse, there's an element as an adult, you start realizing, man, like, why was I placed in vulnerable situations and places where you felt abandoned, or you felt like, there wasn't somebody there to take up for you or protect you or keep you safe. Basically, the elements that a parent's supposed to provide, which is safety and guidance and all those things, love, those things were missing from my foundation and my pyramid. And so those things, and my mother was always, when she was around a lot of violence and violent men, but she always did her best to try to protect me and my brother. But it wasn't until I was 15 years old, I think she had finally reached a place where all the trauma that she had been through her life, she kind of just collapsed in exhaustion, and she turned to drugs, and so she became a drug addict. She dealt with addiction for nearly 30 years. So not long after I became a freshman in high school, my mother ended up in prison for drugs. And so I was forced to live with my aunt and uncle throughout my high school days. And so you can imagine, like, growing up as a young man, not having your father in your life, and then the one person that you did put a lot of emotional and your being into disappears. And so when you're walking out on senior night of basketball, or you're graduating high school, or you're getting married, and you don't have a parent there for those high notes of your life, it can definitely mess with your mind, your emotions, and your formation as a young man. And so those were some of the elements that I walked through in my preteen to teenage years, and even young adult. So
a lot of times we're referring to wounds, and your mom was responding to probably things that have happened in her past. Have you taken time to process through her story as a child, and what wounds may have formed her, and why she ended up becoming where she ended up being at? And if so, would you mind sharing that story?
yeah, absolutely. I think it was maybe 2017. It was either 2017 or 2018. I did a sermon series in our church. We have a value that's called "We Fight for the Land." It's LAND, and so we live in Portland, and that's an acronym for the lost, the addicted, the next generation, and the disconnected. So that's kind of like our heart breaks for those people. And so when I did a sermon on the addicted, I basically approached my mother, who at that time had recovered. She had recovered from being an addict and was doing well. I got to baptize my mom in 2012, and so it's a really cool full circle moment. But I actually asked her, hey, can I just sit down? And for this sermon, it's not going to be a preaching sermon. It's just me and you having a conversation about your story and our story together. And I did it for two reasons. One, to obviously like tell our story, but two, I wanted it to be a healing moment for me and my mother. And that was the first time on camera that I'm listening to my mother tell me stories about her upbringing. She grew up with an alcoholic father. She was sexually abused at 11, 12 years old. And so, yeah, I tell people sometimes when you're finding out about your parents' formation, it's not to excuse them for the behavior, but it's to explain the behavior. And so for me, it was very healing for me to hear, like, man, my mom, she honestly was just doing the best she knew how as a mom, and as a teenage mom, who really, she didn't really have any kind of decent upbringing to help guide her and show her the right way to do it. And so what it did is it built empathy, and it built grace, and it created moments for me to realize, like, hey, she didn't do these things on purpose. Again, it's not an excuse for the things that she did, but it helped explain why she did what she did in certain areas. And so it actually gave me a lot of grace and love toward my mom. And it was a very healing conversation. And man, I've been able to use that clip and send that sermon to so many people who have wrestled with, mother wounds or parent wounds, to go and watch and like see that, hey, it's possible to extend forgiveness. It's possible to see healing formed and all those things. So yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. You mentioned that you didn't meet your dad until he was 15, until you were 15. Do you have memories of men who came into your life before your father came into your life? And if so, would you mind sharing 2 or 3 of them that might stick out? I want to thank you for taking time to listen to this story. And if there's something inside of here that is adding value to you, I want you to stop and hit subscribe. I am on mission to help men become the dads they never had. Many of us struggle with father wounds, addictions, identity issues, and really what we need is we need a model. We need to see people that have broken the patterns and come alongside of them. I want to simply invite you to join me on the journey. Every Thursday, we're going to release a new episode. Each episode is going to help you and others become the dads they never had. Hit subscribe and share with a friend. Now let's get back to the story.
Oh yeah, the probably the 3 most prominent ones. There was one stepdad that I had, and he was married to my mom for a short time, but he was and again, like some of the men my mother met, it wasn't that they were terrible men. It's just that most of them usually had some sort of addiction, some sort of hang up, some sort of wound themselves that kept them from being fully present. So I had one stepdad who, they were married when I was a baby, got divorced, but he stayed in my life. And so he was kind of like a stepdad that I would go visit him. I would go visit his parents when I was young. And so I knew he wasn't my dad, but he was almost like the relationship was more of like a friend, an extended friend that I would go visit from time to time. He's very kind to me and my brother. He would even, he wasn't either one of me and my brother's dads, and he would always, invite us over, and we would go over there and play. His parents treated us like their grandkids. And so that was a pretty positive experience. There's some other things about that story that maybe we'll get into later that I'll share. But the second stepfather was the one that my mother married when I was 8, and he was a cocaine dealer. And he was a very violent man. And so I was physically abused on a regular basis and sexually abused on a regular basis by this man. And he was very, very violent toward my mother, so much so that when we finally got out of that relationship, for the first year, it was, as a child, I just remember looking over my shoulder all the time, like, when's he going to show back up? When's this, you just never knew if the nightmare was truly over. But the third stepfather, my mother remarried when I was about 10. He actually was like my dad. And I'll never forget the first date he took my mother out on. He took me and my brother with him, and we went fishing. And that made my world, because no man had ever showed any interest in me and my brother. When it came to my mom, it was just always like we were just extra baggage. And he was like so kind, gentle. And listen, this sounds like it's fake. I promise you, I'm not making this man up. But his name was Cruz. his last name was spelled differently. It was Cruz. And, but he was a very muscular man. He lifted weights. He rode bulls. So we got to go to rodeos. He was an artist. He he did oil paintings. He did 5Ks. He ran long. He was just like this ultimate man's man. And yet he was also very nurturing and gentle. The problem with Tommy was he was an alcoholic, and he wasn't a mean drunk. He wasn't abusive. When he drank, he would disappear. Like we wouldn't know if he was alive. He would just go on these bingers to where like he would just be shut up in a bar somewhere for sometimes even weeks. And we wouldn't know if he was alive. We wouldn't know. And so my mother was only married to him for about 5.5 years, but it felt like 20 years because that was the longest relationship my mother ever had, ever in her life. And he loved us like his kid. Like that was my dad. Like he taught me how to play basketball. He took us fishing. Like there was a lot of things as a young boy that I learned from him. My love for basketball was like because of him. And right after I met my biological father, he went through several stints. My stepdad had went through several stints of like, hey, he's clean, he's good, he'd be sober for a year, fall off the wagon again. We even moved to Washington State for a year just to try to help his sobriety because that's where his family was from. And so we thought, well, maybe if he's close to siblings, close to family, he'll stay sober. He was a logger by trade, and so the money and the work was much better up in the Northwest, obviously. And we got there, and he did good for about 3 months, and then it happened again, and so we ended up moving back to Tennessee, and that's when my biological father started coming around. He had contacted my mom somehow and was like, "Hey, I want to start to try to mend this relationship with my son." And I remember thinking like, man, I got a dad. I'm cool. Like, I don't need this, like I would go visit him just because he bought me stuff. Because growing up, I didn't have anything. And so if he's going to try to like buy my love, hey, I'll take all. I mean, that's just how I was selfish. I was a teenage boy trying to deal with all those wounds. And then I'll never forget, Josh, man, it was a Friday afternoon. I didn't know that my mom and stepdad had been having some problems and that he had actually been drinking again because he had been sober for like a year up to this point. And apparently she had told him, hey, you're going to have to make a decision. We've been going through this for 5.5 years. Like it's either the alcohol or it's us. And I'll never forget, we lived in an apartment building. It was me, my brother, my mom, my stepdad, my aunt, and my grandmother. We lived in a 2-bedroom apartment. My bedroom was the dining room. I slept on an air mattress in the dining room. My brother slept on the couch in the living room. And then my parents had a bedroom. And then my grandmother and aunt shared a bedroom. I'm laying there on a Friday afternoon. I think I was making a mixtape for all you young people out there that don't know what that is. But I was listening to my music and laying there. And my mother come in and she was visibly upset. And she went into the room and was talking with my grandmother and aunt. And so I walked back there like, man, what's going on? And she went to go pick up my stepdad from work that day. And she said he came to the car and he was smiling and said, tell the boys I love them, and left. And I never saw him again. To this day, I've not seen, like, I went to school that morning, said goodbye to him, and that was the last time I've ever seen or heard from him. And that devastated me in the worst way possible. And then trying to like wrestle with the emotion of, I have this biological dad who stepped into my life, trying to build a relationship. And then like the only one dad I really knew is now gone. And with that one, it was the opposite of the other stepdad, where I wasn't looking over my shoulder like, is this guy coming back? I would visit. We would be driving around town, and if I saw somebody walking on the side of the street, I would, I'm rubbernecking out the window to see if it's him, just so I can see him again, say hi, do something, try to talk him into coming back, right? Because there was a part of me that's like, I know he loves us, like he'll be back. Like there was part of me that was just like, I know he'll be back. And And I've even made attempts like trying to figure out how to track him down, and can't find him. I don't know. So yeah, that was a very, very formative year of my life between my freshman and sophomore year of high school. So
It's almost hard to ask a follow-up question when you're processing the emotions of that experience.
yeah,
Now that we have kids, and
Yeah.
what it's like.
absolutely.
When you look at where you were in this time, what was your ideas of what it meant to be a man? What did, if you were to paint a picture of what a man looked like in your mind at 15, 16 years
Mhm.
old, who would have been the quintessential ideal man, and how did it form your idea of responsibility, accountability, or just being a man?
And that's the thing, Josh, like I grew up in the 80s and 90s. So there was a sense of like, hey, a man looks like, Sylvester Stallone or Arnold Schwarzenegger, or, like, I think that's why I had such a affinity for my stepdad, was because like here was this chiseled, exterior physical man who like loved well. Like he had a compassionate side. And that was something I had never seen in my life. And so I think I walked away with so much confusion, Josh, because there was a part of me that I was hyper-sexualized at 8 years old, walking through being introduced to pornography. My stepdad forced me to watch pornography at 8 years old. I was so hyper-sexualized that there was a part of me that, being a man is, entering into sexual intercourse as young as you possibly can, but there was so much. It was like even growing into a teenage boy or growing into a 16, 17, 18-year-old young man, I still had the emotional capacity of that 8 or 9-year-old. And so for me, it's like I almost wrestle with this idea of like, I don't know what an authentic or real man looks like, because everything that I thought that I wanted to be as a man, Josh, I can't even explain it, man. There was so much inner turmoil. All I knew is that I was not that. I was not a real man, because I cried all the time. I was a very emotional kid. Things made me angry easily. Things would set me off easily. I cried over any girlfriend that broke up with me, in middle school or high school. It was devastating. It was like anything that kind of maybe triggered a sense of abandonment or being left behind, or I'm not worthy, I'm not good enough, I'm not worthy to be loved. I didn't realize it at the time. I'm looking back now and recognizing why those things existed. But at the time, when you're trying to figure out what it means to be a man, I was all I knew was I was nowhere near what it was. And that created so much insecurity. It created so much just inner turmoil, anger, frustration, all the things. And so, in my mind, I guess it was like this super tough, big and bold, and definitely hypersexualized. And there was a part of me that felt like I could never realize that part of being a man anyway. So.
Did you ever turn to addictions, gangs, unhealthy relationships, or anger to cope?
Oh, my addiction was definitely pornography. It was definitely relationships. Like I felt like the more, if I had a female relationship in my life, or if I was pursuing physical relationship with a female, then to me, man, I'm living it. I think early in my teenage years, I was with a pretty rough crowd that could have led to some of those things. I'm thankful, and it's great. Like, God's incredible, right? Like when you're watching things get pieced together in your life, I saw being moved into my aunt and uncle's house as like this moment of devastation, but it probably helped save my life in a lot of ways, because I lived in a smaller town, because I was in Murfreesboro, when all that happened. And so I was already like, I was around people who sold dope all the time. I was doing dope all the time. I was with pretty rough people. And I think if I would have stayed there, if my mother would have kept us there, I would have definitely walked down a road that probably would have looked a lot like my family tree on both sides, which is jail time, addiction, divorces, all this stuff. And so actually being forced to move with my aunt and uncle, like they were consistent in church. I didn't grow up in church, but that was my first exposure to church was, when I was a freshman in high school. And so there was an element there where they created some anchors for my life that I didn't have, even though at the time I didn't appreciate it nor care for it. Those things probably actually kept me from walking down a road that would have been way, way worse, So even though I still had all these, this porn addiction, emotional immaturity, relationship issues, I wasn't chasing drugs or violence like I was early on. So that pretty much saved my life, probably.
What would you say was your rock bottom moment inside of your life when you look back? You're like, man, I didn't want to end up here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, to me, I think it's happened a couple of times. There's an incredible book called An Invitation to a Journey. And it's about like your spiritual formation and your arc, what that looks like throughout your life. And so it kind of talks about almost like multiple salvation moments. It's not that you have to get saved multiple times, but it's those moments of like, it's like another leap and bound to your spiritual life and realization. And so first and foremost was my salvation experience at 18 years old. Like I was one of the first people to graduate high school, but also go to college in both sides of my family. Again, like both sides of my family riddled with nothing but dysfunction and brokenness. And outwardly, everybody saw me as, man, here's this kid, he's making it, he's doing great, making good grades, plays basketball. But like inwardly, I was still chasing. I love what C.S. Lewis says about his own life. When you think about C.S. Lewis, here's this Oxford professor, bow tie, the contemplation pipe, right? And he's hanging out with J.R.R. Tolkien, and they're just like this intelligent. But he said before Jesus, he was just an inward, nothing but inwardly, he was a legion full of lust and demons. And I feel like that's where I was at 18 years old. It was like I could do a really good job of making people think my life looked pretty good on the outside, but I was still chasing things that were going to lead me down to the same exact road as my parents. And so I'll never forget, Josh, it was a Sunday morning and I was actually really sick. I had a fever, and my aunt was one of those, she didn't play. Like if you're going to live in her house, you're going to go to church. She doesn't care if your leg's broken, like she was raising 4 teenage boys. All of us were in high school, 4 high school boys in the same house. Like, dude, it was wild. And so I can't imagine like what she put up with on a daily basis with us. But I remember telling her like, hey, I'm not feeling well. She's like, well, you can stay home. And I said, no. I said, I think I'm going to go. And I don't even know like what made me say it that morning, Josh. I think the Lord had been kind of like doing some stuff in my heart a couple of weeks before that. Just slow little things. And we pulled up. It was a little bitty country church in Adolphus, Kentucky. Gravel. It's on a hill called Shooting Hill, because this is where the rednecks go to drink beer and shoot their guns off. And so on the side of this old country church is like bullet holes and just a little bitty country church in the middle of nowhere. And I walked in the front door and walked straight to the altar. No message, no song, no nothing. And I fell on my face. And all I knew was like my life up to this point didn't make sense. I felt like I was empty. I felt like I was worthless. I felt like there was nothing for me. And I just told God, I don't want to carry this. I don't want to carry this guilt anymore. I don't want to carry this shame. I don't want to carry this hatred in my heart. And he radically saved me. I mean, radically saved me. I mean, I went from trying to avoid church to like every time the doors are open, like give me a purpose, give me something to do. Like I want to be here. I was hungry. Here I was, a freshman in college, and I went from like hanging out with all the dope heads and, bumping Dre and Snoop to like I'm sitting by myself in an apartment on a Friday night, listening to worship music and reading my Bible. Just like, man, I just want to know more about God's word. And that was one moment. And then I would say God saved my soul, but I still hadn't been delivered. I'd gotten out of Egypt, but I was still circling the desert, you know. And I did that for many years. And up until about 2015, I tell people 2015 to 2017 were the hardest, darkest, yet most incredible years of my life, because we walked through a series of trials as a family that seemed like one trial after another. I had a brother-in-law that almost died of alcoholism. We went through a 3-month process of trying to care for him in a hospital where we thought we're preparing for a funeral. He nearly drank himself to death. Praise God, we're on the other side of where he survived, and he's still battling his addiction today, but doing so much better than he was then. I told you about my dad, about how, like, you know, we had basically spent years trying to, I felt like when I was ready to maybe try to start restoring things, he was still searching for himself. And then he would come around and he would be like ready. He actually gave his heart and life to the Lord, but I couldn't even appreciate it or celebrate it because I still had so much animosity toward him from our past. And so he's like trying to love on me and be kind and pour into me. And I didn't want to hear it, you know, because I was just selfish and prideful. And, but we had finally got to this place. My son was just born. My son was born in February of 2015. And we were talking about plans of getting together and him meeting my son, because he, you know, he had met my girls and he had been kind of in and out of my life over the years. And, man, I had an incredible phone conversation with him on a Friday afternoon. I'll never forget. We had like an hour-long conversation while I'm driving to Memphis to do a wedding. And a week later, the Sunday before Father's Day, I wake up and I have a voicemail, and it's from my dad's sister. And I remember I'm getting up, like getting ready to start my Sunday, like I'm going to go preach. And I had to play this voicemail several times because I couldn't believe it. But my dad had dropped dead of a heart attack suddenly. And I didn't find out until the next morning, you know, with this voicemail. And regardless of how close you are with your dad, there's something that happens inside of a man that when your dad dies, you start searching for answers. You start trying to like find yourself. And so that started that journey of me trying to figure out who am I as a man. Here I've got 3 kids at this time, Josh. I'm married. I'm a pastor. And yet I don't even know who I am as a man. I realize like I'm still carrying so much weight and bitterness from my childhood. And so right after that, about a month later, this was kind of the culmination. We were getting to where we were pulling up at church, and me and my wife would just sit in the van and cry because of like the stuff we were walking through with both of our families. And we pulled up at church one day. And so this goes back to the stepdad that I told you that was kind of a friend. We would go visit him. Well, again, he was a loving man, but he also had a porn addiction and a pot addiction. So I remember as a child, I'd be like sneaking around a corner, watching him watch porn or watching them get high, you know, whatever. Well, he had a neighbor who was, at the time, I think I was 10. I think he was a senior in high school or whatever. And on several occasions, he sexually abused me. And so that happened during that time period. So from the time I was 8 until I was 11, I was sexually abused by 3 different people, and including a stepdad, a babysitter, and then this guy. And so fast forward 2016, I believe, or 2015, we pull up to church. We're talking to some volunteers out setting up in the parking lot. And one of the gentlemen and I began to have a conversation with him. And then within 5 minutes, I realized that the man who sexually abused me when I was 10 is standing right in front of me. And he's volunteers in our church. And that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. Like I went into a 2-month depression. I would show up every week and try to sneak in and sneak out of my own church. I tried to avoid people. I started having nightmares every night that something terrible was going to happen to my son. I dreamed that he died. He was kidnapped. And it was like, I mean, when I say every night, that's not an exaggeration. I lived in terror, Josh. And So I did this for 2 months. I couldn't tell my wife because my wife knew about my upbringing, but I had never told her graphic stories about what happened to me. I'd never told anybody. And I just remember I would daydream about taking other jobs. I'm like, maybe I can find a job like selling cars or just doing something. I would try to figure out ways that I could get rid of the church, like hand it off to somebody else. At the time, we were still portable. We were setting up and tear down in a school every week. And fast forward, man, I finally just like the Lord, like really is just like, you're going to have to tell somebody. If you don't tell somebody, like this is not going to end well. And I finally got the courage to tell my wife, partly the courage. I was in the shower. I couldn't even look at her in the face. And she was getting ready. I'm in the shower. And I'm trying to tell her from the shower what's going on. The walls came down, Josh, and I just wept and wept. And I'm hyperventilating, trying to tell her what's going on with me. And of course, this whole time, the enemy's got it in your mind, like, hey, the moment you share this stuff, she's going to look at you differently. She's going to think you're gross. She's going to think you're whatever. And man, the exact opposite was true. Like it actually made our marriage stronger. Man, my wife loved me so incredibly through this entire process. Long story short, she helped me confess to a group of pastors what was going on. They paid for my counseling. They helped start me on a journey. I'll never forget, I had a pastor friend. He had asked me, he's like, have you ever done a sabbatical? And I'm like, I don't even know what that means. And he said, every year I do a solitude sabbatical. It's a prayer sabbatical. He's like, why don't you come hang out with me for a couple of days? And then I'll show you kind of like how to do one. And so I did that. And man, those 2 days I spent with him, like I was just in awe because I was just like, this is available, like this kind of time. Because I tell you what I had done, Josh, I spent so many years in ministry. I didn't realize it. You don't do it consciously. And that's why I have so much grace towards pastors who fall, because I think what we're seeing is like the result of broken men who never find healing or find a place to be authentic and vulnerable about their struggles. And I had done so much ministry, Josh, out of this place of trying to earn love and worthiness. If I can lead a successful youth group, then maybe I'm worth something. If I can lead a successful church plant, maybe God does love me. Everything was out of this selfish, insecure, prideful. And man, God took me on a journey because I read every leadership book. I was like every leadership podcast. And Josh, I was a great leader. I was a terrible disciple of Jesus. And so I'll never forget, a couple months later, that September, I did my very first sabbatical on my own, prayer sabbatical. And Josh, when I tell you, it was like a week felt like a year where I just allowed God to love on me. And I started reading books for the first time. I had never heard the term spiritual formation. I had never heard anything like that. I thought this was like new buzzwords. And then you realize like, this is ancient. Like, why aren't we talking about this in the church? And so I went on about a 2 to 3 year journey where I just said, Lord, all I'm doing is allowing you to like shape me. Like, I don't even care about like growing this church, doing those things. Like, I just want to know what it means to know you more and focus on my spiritual formation. And so out of that, I tell people today, we are just now living in the fruit of what God began to plant in my heart and life in 2017. And so from about 2016 to 2021, that was, and I'm still on that journey. The journey doesn't end, but that was like God uprooted so much of what have formed me in ministry and in life. And it's taken a good 5 years for us to course correct in that as a church, course correct that in my own life. And it's been beautiful. It's been so hard, but it's been a good difficult. It's been one of those things. And so for me, that was my favorite rock bottom, because those 2 years of walking through all that heartache and pain actually led to my freedom, and it led to my wholeness. I'll never forget one of my last sessions with my Christian counselor. And he asked me, he's like, so are you afraid of this guy? He's like, if you were to fight this dude, could you win? And I thought it was such an odd question, from a counselor. He was like, I don't want to fight this guy. I was like, but yeah, 100% I could take him, like he's older now, all this stuff. And he said, well, then you need to go tell 10-year-old you that you're safe. You're okay. And for the first time, I realized, like, the moment I saw him, I had reverted back to 10-year-old me. And what I didn't even realize is really that's how I lived. I mean, I was in my 30s, almost 40, and I still had the emotional, mental capacity of that 10-year-old, that every time conflict or tension arose in my life, I reverted back to that state, which is avoid conflict, avoid tension, avoid telling the truth. Because if you tell the truth and there's going to be conflict, if there's going to be conflict, you're going to be abused. And so it was just this constant cycle through my life, or even like being vulnerable with my wife was very difficult, because if you tell the truth, there's going to be consequences to pay. And so if my wife knows what's really going on with me, if she knows about the porn addiction, if she knows about the abuse, if she knows about these things, then the consequences are going to be devastating and you're going to be left alone. And so you don't realize those things are forming you throughout life, that even as a pastor, as a dad, that there is an inner child in you that hasn't healed, and you're automatically reverting back to those automatic. I mean, it's like blinking. Like you just learn to that's your survival mode. Like, I'm going to survive by making sure the boat doesn't get rocked. People like me. And so that's why I was a people pleaser all my entire life, emotionally unstable, couldn't share my real feelings, because if I do that, it's just going to lead to being abandoned again. People are going to leave. And so, yeah, man, I've been on that was my favorite rock bottom. It wasn't at the time, but that has definitely made a huge impact in my life today. I'm actually currently, it's funny you talked about a book, I'm writing a book right now too, just about my story and how I hope to lead men. And that's my passion today. My passion is to help lead men to wholeness, freedom, and spiritual formation. About 3 years ago, we hosted our annual men's retreat, and it was a pivotal moment for our men's community and our church. We had, when I tell you this was off the cuff, it was incredible, Josh. We just finished a session, and our worship leader just starts sharing his heart about, like, man, I need to confess something to everybody. And when I tell you, it was 3.5 hours from that moment, Josh, 3.5 hours of over 100 men getting up one by one, confessing sin, confessing abuse, confessing stuff that's happened in their childhood. When I tell you, almost 90-something% of the men at this retreat have been sexually abused. I think sometimes when we say those things, we're like, oh, well, that's odd. That's an outlier. And I'm here to tell you, it is not. Like, it is crazy how many men, not just women, we think it's a woman problem, that only women get sexually abused or assaulted. And it is not true. So many of these men, you're talking about men who on the outside, they are they drive the big pickup truck. They're rough and tough, beards, and they are inner children because of what happened to them when they were a boy. So that's been, man, the last 3 or 4 years, we have watched God do an incredible movement in the men of our church because they're finding healing and wholeness. So I know I don't know if I'm talking too much or whatever. You can interrupt anytime, but.
Well, we've got 7 sections to go through. We've made through 3. And so what I want to do is I do want to invite you to a second conversation in the future, or to talk about your book, to talk about, when I hear you share about a retreat, I'm like, man, we need more dudes being invited to retreats or revival hit these cities, and people from people who don't normally go to church need to be invited. And we need to bring revival and healing, because in reality, your story, my story, the dudes that are listening to this, it's more normal than we realize.
Yes.
Majority of us have been abused sexually, physically, and it's created this inner child. But I want to give you, I'm thinking about all the dudes that are listening to this. There's a pastor that's listening, and your story is his story. And he's like, where do I go? Where do I start as it relates to what do I need to do? So if you could speak into the pastor, the dude that's been abused and hasn't shared it with anybody, that has a lot of the emotions, what would you share with them to do next? Or, please share. Do you have an incredible story of overcoming the home that you were raised in? Or maybe the father wounds that were placed inside your life? If so, I want to share it with other dudes without dads. Simply go to dudeswithoutdadspodcast.com and apply to be a guest on the show. The reason it's important to share your story is because when you share what God has done for you, it helps other men believe that God can do it for them, and He can. To share your story, head over to Dudes Without Dads podcast today.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny because that's the portion of the book that I'm finishing up. Like we're halfway through the editing process right now, getting that stuff shaped up. What I'm trying to do now is go back and create next steps for all my chapters. But the first part, the first step is the hardest step, and it really is finding a safe place to share everything. There's a great book called The Body Keeps the Score. But it really is coming to terms with this idea of realizing like everything who I am as an adult today has been shaped by my childhood experiences, like how I respond in conflict and arguments and tension. Whenever tension arises, there's another great book called The Leader's Journey, Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. Those are 3 great books that I think if you're interested, if you really want to go on that journey. There's also one called The Wounded Healer and The Wounded Heart. Those are all great books. And The Wounded Heart especially is specific for adults who have experienced childhood abuse, sexual abuse. But I think whether it's counseling, and I know like everybody has different experiences with counseling. Like I had a fantastic experience. I've heard some people, they go and they're like, I didn't like the counselor, whatever. So I would say give it a try, because that might be the first safe place you feel like you can go.
Okay.
But I think finding community. Right now, the greatest issue we have with men between 18 and 35 is they are lonely. They do not know how to like build solid relationships and community where they can be fully vulnerable, fully authentic. The book of Leader's Journey, it talks about how like we need to have this reality of where is the gap between I know what's right, but I'm actually what my life looks like, and that gap is called compromise. And the more that I like confess, like, hey, here's where I know in my life I am disobedient, that I know that I'm not living up to, like, I know it's right, but I can't do it. That compromise has always been shaped by our childhood experiences. Secondly, you need to have a community of grace and truth that's constant in your life. And that may take time. That's the hard part, is that most people want like the overnight friendships. The kind of stuff that I'm talking about, like when I talk about like, I tell people like find your 8. Who are the people who they're gonna help carry you through life, but they're also going to carry you in death. They're going to be your pallbearers. Like that takes time, and it takes like you may have to like practice that for a little bit, and then be like, okay, that wasn't the right setting or group. I think these retreats, like you talked about, are great opportunities to connect with men. We've seen so many men find community based off of like being in those retreat settings. Yeah. But the third thing is like, man, I mean, obviously if you're a pastor, this sounds like so cliche, but I'm telling you, we need more men of God who live the liturgy. In other words, they are studying the teachings of Jesus and asking yourself, how does my life match the life of Jesus? Practice the way of Jesus, right? Those sound like 3 concepts that are just like, oh, well, duh. There's no profound like next step. It really is like you need to confess it. You need to talk about it. I don't think people realize how much talking about those things actually starts a healing process within you, like to actually get it out. So most of us have kept it in because of guilt and shame, because the enemy, again, wants you to believe that the moment people hear that from you, that they are going to think differently of you. They're going to judge you. They're going to think you're gross. They're going to think you're weird. But really, healing is on the other side of our confession. The Bible is so clear on that man, when I confess things, something happens spiritually, something happens emotionally. And it needs to be done in community. Men need community that are trying to also live out this life, the teachings of Jesus. So to me, that's the first step, whether it's counseling, but especially finding a community, because it's not going to be just one conversation. You know, you might think, well, I told somebody. Well, it's still like, here I am, however many years later, and the reason why I enjoy telling my story is because I know every time I tell it, I get healed a little bit more. You know, and so I think it's just important, man. Find somewhere where you can, like, not just tell people like, hey, I was abused. Like the thing about the book, The Body Teaches the Score, they talk about like even PTSD patients. They said that when they actually talked about the details of what happened to them, they actually experienced more peace. Not just saying like, hey, something bad happened. Like, hey, here's exactly what happened. Here's who hurt me, and here's what they did. And here's how it makes me feel. Because those things, it does, our body carries it. Tensions, most people, I'm going to get on some kind of weird tangent here, but I'm passionate about this stuff, Josh, because I've experienced it. I know I'm taking up your time, but listen, I had physical sickness for years. I would stay on antibiotics, and here I was in the gym all the time, eating healthy. And I'm like, why do I get every infection down the pipe?
Wow.
And you know what I've studied and realized? I went to a holistic doctor, and I just said, like, I'm at my wit's end because I'm tired of taking steroids, antibiotics 3 or 4 times a year. I feel like I stay sick. And it was crazy. It was an iridologist. And I know people may have different views about this stuff, but they can basically look at your eyes, or I've heard of like Mennonite doctors looking at your feet and saying like, hey, I can tell what's wrong with your organs or tell what's wrong with your insides. But also I can address like emotional, spiritual issues in your life. And so I remember she looked at me, she's like, hey, you know, do you have like colon issues, blah, blah, blah. Is that in your family? Like, yeah. She's like, okay, well, here's some supplements you can take. Here's some stuff you can do. She's like, but if you want to talk about the emotional, spiritual stuff, we can. I was like, hit me. This was crazy, Josh. In January, 3 years ago, I had a brother come up to me during 21 days of prayer and fasting. And he's not like that weird prophecy type person, but he was like, hey, the Lord just wanted me to tell you today you're worthy. He's like, I don't know what that means for you, but just want to give you a hug, tell you you're worthy. And at the time I was like, man, I appreciate the encouragement. Love you. Like, thank you. I kid you not. A month later, I go to this doctor and she's telling me about the lungs. I have with my lungs issue. And she's like, that's usually stems. She's like, let me ask you this question. She said, did your mother ever contemplate abortion while she was pregnant with you? Just 2 months before this, my grandmother, because my mother had just passed away, my grandmother says, you know, when your mom was pregnant with you, the doctor tried to talk her into an abortion. And she said, but I told her, you're going to have that baby and God's going to use him. So my grandmother tells me that 2 months before. My brother, a brother in Christ comes up to me a month after that, says, you're worthy. And here this doctor, you know what she says? She says, that's usually a sign of a feeling of unworthiness. When I tell you, I broke down in that doctor's office and starting to realize that a lot of physical sickness, a lot of autoimmune disease, it stems from emotional wounds. It's been proven that the grandchildren of people who were in concentration camps carry the same trauma gene, even though they weren't in concentration camps. When you see the Bible talk about how like the sins are handed down from the father to generations, it's not talking just about like the behavior. It's saying that the wounds themselves carry a response and a reaction that's in our bodies that we don't even realize. And we just live with sickness. We're just like, well, I guess I'll find a pill for this. And we don't realize that if we would get healed emotionally and spiritually and mentally, we would actually feel better in our bodies. I'm going to get off my soapbox now on that. So, but
Pastor Brandon, I literally just want to hit the floor and start talking our time in prayer, because I just need to spend time with my Heavenly Father. And so anybody that's listening today, there is no better communicator or pastor that I have had the privilege to listen to than Pastor Brandon Petty. And so you can go to his website. Would you mind sharing your website so anybody that might want to listen to any of the sermon series you're talking about, or just start following, because not everybody has a Generation Church in their city. And so please let them know where they can go.
Sure. Generationchurch.me is the website. Of course, you click on media, you'll find sermons there. But we have a YouTube channel to Generation Church, Portland, Tennessee. If you'll Google that, you'll find our YouTube channel where all the sermons are up. So yeah, you can watch there.
Yeah. And to every dude that's listening today, I want you to know that you're not your wound. Your story's not over. And Jesus can take what deformed you and actually turn it into a transformational story. God's desire is to break the cycle of generational curses or generational cycles in our stories. And so I want to encourage you, before you go today, the story of your past doesn't have to be the story of your future. And by the grace of God and the blood of Jesus, everything can change, and you're never more than one step away. Pastor
Hey, and
Brent,
one more thing before you close. I just want to add to that. I just want to remind people too, my testimony is not I was abused and then now I forget. My testimony is I was a sinner and now I'm saved by grace. And the reason why I want to share that is because God loves us so much that not only does he want to end the hostility between us and him that sin has created, he loves us so much that he goes beyond that to say, now that I've healed you from the wounds that sin has caused, let's talk about the wounds that are going on that other people's sins have caused in your life. And that's how much God loves us, man. And so that's my testimony. I think sometimes testimonies can be like, oh, bad things happen to me and then good thing. But really, man, I just want people to know, man, I was a wretched sinner too. And God loved me so much that he reached out and saved me from my sin, but also loves me enough to heal me from the sin that happened to me. So
good. And he can do it for you. Brandon,
amen.
my brother, thank you for your time. And I look forward to reading your book. I feel like I don't need to write one. I just need to read yours. And so thank you so much for everything that you are and everything that you stand for and what you're doing for Portland and beyond.
Thank you, brother.
Forgiveness is more for you than them. I had inner peace for the first time in my life.
It's just Jesus. Just Jesus.